Okay, we're now recording. Go ahead, Tom. Welcome. Sign in, please. Hold on, Tom. I don't hear you. Scott, can you give a little hand here?
Now we're set here.
Yeah, that's better.
I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speaker this evening, Ambassador Jundai Fraser. This is a first in the nearly 40 years that I have been doing Great Decisions programs here and elsewhere. This is the first time that our presenter will be the author of the article in the Great Decisions workbook. So it's a special evening. I'm also delighted to be able to introduce another of my former colleagues from the U.S. government. Jundai was the senior director for Africa at the National Security Council when I was assistant secretary in the State Department. She's a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution and an adjunct senior fellow for Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations. I've already used up some time because my battery was dead in my car. So I don't want to spend any more time on introductions. I'm sure when we hear Jundai's discussion of the United States and Africa, you will determine for yourself that she is extremely well qualified to speak with us this evening. So welcome, Jundai from Chicago. Is that where you are?
I'm in Virginia.
Okay. Bring her up on the screen here. Okay, we're ready and welcome.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you this evening, or yeah, I guess it's evening there too. I will talk about U.S. engagement with Africa, but I'll do it first by talking about Africa's growing importance globally. Then I will look specifically at the Trump administration and how it has articulated its priorities in Africa. Then move to China as their playbook. Then I will move to what are the challenges to achieving U.S. Priorities on the continent in terms of what are Africa's economic development challenges. I went in great detail in the article on Nigeria, but I will broaden out that lens to talk about the continent more generally. And then finally ending with what are the opportunities for U.S. statecraft and engagement to try to achieve our objectives, our long-term strategic objectives, as well as this current administration's interests. So as I said, Africa, when we look at Africa in the world, it's growing in its geopolitical and economic importance. And this is largely driven by external competition for Africa's natural wealth. The world's facing climate challenges, and we are involved in a rapid expansion of 21st century technology. And Africa is a place where those resources to achieve either net zero climate change or to build out our technology, semiconductors, electric vehicles, et cetera, more of a green economy matters. The World Bank projects that to meet the rising global demand, the production of minerals and metals such as lithium, graphite, cobalt will need to increase nearly 500% by 2015. And achieving net zero goal requires renewables in the energy mix. Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral resources, many which are critical to climate, dealing with the climate change and 21st century low carbon technologies, including electric vehicles, battery storage, green hydrogen, geothermal, and semiconductors, as I mentioned. And Africa has an abundance of those minerals as well as sun, water, wind for a renewable energy transition. Africa also has significant gas reserves and natural gas. It's 9% of global proven natural gas reserves and between 8 and 12% of the global oil reserves in the world. Now, in this competition for these resources, I have to say that China is basically winning. If you look at Africa's solar and hydro development, China's building dams across the continent for hydropower, and low-cost Chinese solar panels are powering Africa's rural areas. When you think about or look at the minerals, 70% of Congolese cobalt is exported to China, and Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has 75% of the world's cobalt. 15 of the 19 cobalt mines in DRC are owned or financed by entities in China. 72% of platinum reserves are in South Africa, which is the world's largest reserves. And China is the third largest supplier of lithium and it's rapidly investing in lithium mines in Africa, which by 2030 will allow it to control 75% of that mineral. And so we really are not winning the competition over natural resources. A second reason why Africa's importance is growing in the world is because of its demographic profile. Today, 1.53 billion people live in Africa, making it the second most populous continent after Asia. It is also the fastest growing region with 2% average annual growth. The world is at 0.7% and North America is at 0.5%. Also, Africa has the fastest growing working age population, which is absolutely critical. When China made its great rise economically, as well as India, it was because of the concentration of its working age population. In Africa, that's growing at 2.3% annually. The world's percentage is 0.6%, and North America's 0.3%. So by 2035, Africa will have the largest workforce in the world of 1.1 billion people, meaning that 1 in every 4 workers will be African. By 2050, Africa's population is projected to be 2.5 billion, or a quarter of the world's population. And at the turn of the century, Africa is projected to be 40% of the world's population. And its greatest asset, I believe, is actually its young population, which at this time averages about 19 years old, and it represents 60% of the total population. Now, we all know that that can be an asset, as I said, but if those young people don't have opportunities for economic advancement, i.e. jobs, or the possibility of becoming entrepreneurs and investing, and if they don't have the education and health, then that also can actually be one of Africa's greatest, it's one of its challenges today, but it can actually lead to greater instability, conflict on the continent. A third area where Africa's importance in the world matters is in terms of global governance. Africa, with 54 countries, is the largest bloc of the UN's 5 regional groups. It represents 28% of UN members. It has 3 non-permanent seats on the UN Security Council. And unfortunately, Africa countries are increasingly voting with China's political agenda at the UN, is voting to place Chinese candidates in leadership positions at UN agencies and bodies, is voting with China on sensitive matters like Taiwan and the South China Sea, and is also voting with China and Russia on technology standards and cybersecurity rules. So this is an area where we need to pay significant attention. And then if you look at what is being set up or established, the BRICS countries as an alternative to a Western-dominated international system. Africa used to have just one member, South Africa, but now Egypt and Ethiopia have joined the BRICS, and Nigeria and Algeria are recognized as partners of the BRICS. And the importance there is that these are not small African countries. These are major regional powers on the continent that have joined the BRICS. When we look at America's long-term interest in Africa, strategic lines of communication have always been important, and that continues to be the importance of Africa in the world. It's the second largest continent, covering 20% of the Earth's land area. It's situated along major sea lines of communication and trade on the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and the Gulf of Aden. And we see what's happening now with the the Strait of Hormuz and how important geography continues to matter for global affairs, global competition, geopolitical and economic interests. And if we just take one example of the importance of Africa's location, there are the little country of Djibouti, which sits in the Horn of Africa, has at least 11 foreign military bases there. It hosts the US, China, France, Japan, Italy, and Saudi Arabia have military bases, and Germany and Spain also have small detachments there, making it one of the most concentrated areas of foreign military presence in the world. And then finally, in terms of long-term US strategic interests, I will talk about the Atlantic Alliance. Unfortunately, and I think this is probably one of the biggest barriers to America having sustainable long-term strategic engagement in Africa, is that we've often looked at the continent as more of interest for us because of other countries' interests. And what I mean by that is, if you take, for instance, after World War II, Africa was basically treated by the United States as an area for Europe's economic recovery after the war, where you could again get resources. And we continue to support, even though we articulated something very different in the Atlantic Charter, but we continue to support Europe's colonial enterprise on the continent. And then during the Cold War, we saw Africa mainly as a theater for competition with the Soviet Union. And now today, we see Africa mainly as a theater for competition with China. And so Africa has never been we've never had a direct interest that allowed us to have deeper relations and more sustainability in our engagement. So now let's talk about the Trump administration and what it sees as its interests. We've talked about long-term strategic interests of America, Atlantic Alliance, lines of communication, and strategic resources. Well, the Trump administration, in a 29-page national security strategy, devoted 3 paragraphs to Africa, the very last paragraphs of the national security strategy. And in it, basically, they set out their interests as ameliorating conflict, fostering mutually beneficial trade relations, and transitioning from a foreign aid paradigm to an investment and growth paradigm that is capable of harnessing Africa's abundant natural resources and latent economic potential. No one can argue with those interests. They see the opportunities there to be engagement to negotiate settlements to ongoing conflicts, mentioning specifically the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. And you'll recall that President Trump hosted a summit with President Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and President Kagame at the U.S. Institute of Peace to negotiate a peace agreement there. That peace agreement fell apart within about a month of the signing. And they also want to prevent new conflicts, for example, between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia being specifically mentioned. So the Horn of Africa continues to be a hotspot. And the Horn of Africa has not only drawn in U.S. interests, which have been historical, but also Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Gulf countries, Turkey. They're all engaged in the Horn and North Africa in particular. The second opportunity is, again, this amending the approach of aid, amending an approach to move from aid towards investment. And they specifically mentioned the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which was an initiative that was developed under the Clinton administration, expanded under the Bush administration, continued throughout the Obama administration and the first Trump administration. But it was set to expire in September of 2025. It did expire, but in February, President Trump signed an extension of AGOA to December of 2026. And this is extremely important because AGOA is the only trade framework that we have with the continent of Africa. And then the third opportunity or area of focus that the national security strategy sets out for Africa is to remain wary of resurgent Islamist terrorist activity in parts of Africa while avoiding long-term American commitments and America's presence. And so again, I think that no one would argue with those, seeing those as opportunities in areas that require continued focus. The challenge is going to be, how do you do this? And when we talk about the real challenges to economic development in Africa, you will see why we need a more robust approach and strategy. So what Trump's administration's Africa policy boils down to is critical minerals, oil and gas, stopping terrorism, and making room for American business, primarily transactional and commercial in orientation. Now, when we go to China and Xi Jinping's playbook in Africa, basically during Hu Jintao's time as the head of China, the premier of China, he looked at Africa primarily mercantilistically. Again, Africa is a source of natural resources, which helped to provide markets for Chinese exports. China was also exporting lots of weapons into the region, in Sudan and Zimbabwe in particular, and trying to increase its economic engagement. Now, Xi Jinping has much more of a political geostrategic interest on the continent. And with this rise to power in 2012, there has been a dramatic expansion of engagement on the continent. It's a far more ambitious global aspirations. Basically, he is setting himself up as the leader of the global South. He sees Africa as an important theater for that. He's trying to push an alternative model of development and governance to that of the Western liberal order. And he is indeed trying to replace that liberal economic order. So Africa is a theater of geostrategic competition. Africa is a source of political support, and Africa is a market for Chinese ideology and for its exports. And this is primarily being done through China's Belt and Road Initiative, which every African country has signed up to, except for the small country Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland. China is heavily, heavily invested in Africa's ports, its rails, its roads, and its energy sector. It has significant commercial security and strategic, this has significant commercial security and strategic consequences for U.S. foreign policy. It also has launched its Silk Road initiative, and it's with significant investment in Africa's digital infrastructure. In fact, Huawei has been the source of about 80% of Africa's 4G and 5G network on the continent. You actually can't do very much in the digital area without working or utilizing Huawei's technology and their products. During the first Trump administration, he found out this because he tried to ban all U.S. government agencies from using Huawei, and USAID would not have been able to do its work on the continent without using that infrastructure. And the American Chamber of Commerce also said that American companies in Africa would be significantly impacted and disadvantaged if they weren't allowed to use Huawei. So you see, United States has a very focused, under the Trump administration, a very focused interest, primarily economic, but also some security, whereas China has a much broader playbook that is interested in leveraging Africa politically, globally, to elevate its own position in the world. So what are the challenges? What are Africa's economic development challenges that any U.S. policy, any U.S. strategy, any U.S. statecraft will have to confront to be able to achieve our objectives, both our long-term and also this current administration's? First, let's talk about what are the structural challenges for development in Africa. One is that there's many fragmented small markets. As I mentioned, there are 54 countries on the continent. Many of them are landlocked. Their economies have been oriented towards extractive raw material exports. So there's very little value addition or manufacturing taking place. The infrastructure is also geared to export, mainly export to the metropole or the former colonial powers. There's not a lot of infrastructure that integrates those 54 countries regionally. So the interior road networks aren't as developed as those going to export out. So Africa's integration in the global economy is basically as an exporter of unrefined natural resources, which means that it's highly vulnerable to external commodity shocks and also to unfavorable commodity prices and global price fluctuations. And this external shock is just a continuing story for the continent's progress. The latest shock, of course, is that of the Iran, the war, or I don't know if we call it a war or we call it a military action, but with the Strait of Hormuz and the oil prices going up to almost $100 or more a barrel, that's going to significantly undermine African development, economic development. So these exogenous shocks have been a big challenge. During the Ukraine-Russia war, the price of food went up significantly. And that undermines these countries and their economies, except for the oil exporting countries. There's also the regional factor. As I said, intra-African trade is the lowest of any region in the world. It constitutes less than 13% of Africa's total trade. By comparison, if you look at Europe's intracontinental trade, it's 66% of its total. Asia is 63% of its total, and America is 44% of the total. Now, one way in which the United States can, one opportunity is that the African countries in May 2019 established what they call the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which, if it can be implemented fully, will make Africa the largest unified market of over 1.4 billion customers, which surpasses the EU single market and the Southern Command market and the US-Mexico agreement. It would be the largest free trade agreement in the world in terms of countries as well. But that depends on implementation, and this is one area in which the United States could be engaged. That would then significantly support American business, because one of the challenges for any American company trying to do business in Africa is, as I said, there's these small markets with their own set of regulations. And so it's very difficult to scale your business across the continent. So having that Continental Free Trade Agreement and the US government, the US administration working with Africans to make it a reality would in fact achieve one of the results that President Trump is looking for, which is to support American companies there. The second area of challenge is Africa has a massive infrastructure deficit. And this is where they are so reliant on China's Belt and Road initiative to help them build out that infrastructure. Africa has 20%, as I mentioned, 1/5 of the world's land area, but it's less than 8% of the world's road and rail infrastructure. And so without the relevant infrastructure to facilitate the movement within the continent, this inter-African trade agreement will not actually be accessible, regardless of whether they reduce tariffs and try to harmonize their regulations. You have to have that broader infrastructure. The third challenge to economic development on the continent is energy. A prerequisite for economic development is energy, and just over 55% of Africa population has access to electricity today, compared to over 90% of the rest of the world. So what that means is about 600 million people in Africa are with no access to electricity. and this is, of course, 600 million is more than the combined population of France, Japan, US, and the UK. So 4 out of every 5 people without electricity globally live in Africa. So poor road, rail, or networks, insufficient access to electricity will definitely hinder any ability of American companies to do business in Africa. But this is also an opportunity because it's an area in which they can invest more heavily, particularly with economic and financial initiatives like the U.S. International Development Corporation providing finance to American companies to be able to do business and expand business in Africa. One of the other opportunities is because of this lack of infrastructure, Africa has basically limited legacy infrastructure, which allows it to be able to leapfrog. And we saw this definitely in the mobile digital area with mobile money platforms that are across the continent, even with such small things that we now take for granted, texting and WhatsApping, communication. All of that was well advanced in Africa, even before in the United States, because we still had our landline phones to use, whereas they didn't have that, so they needed to leapfrog. Banking is also an area where they've leapfrogged, with mobile banking being an excellent example. Africa has one of the world's largest money market, mobile money market, reaching over $1 trillion in 2021. And so the opportunity for ITC, digital infrastructure, I think is going to be an area where, one, United States with its innovation is leading, although China is heavily investing in that infrastructure. But the apps and other types of services, digital services, I think the United States is quite ahead. So what are the opportunities, as I'm going to conclude soon, but what are the opportunities for the United States here? One, I think that if you look at U.S.-Africa policy, it has, one of the advantages has been it's been extremely bipartisan in nature. There has been significant continuity across administrations, both in their stated priorities as well as in building on the initiatives. I mentioned that the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, Clinton administration, and continued all the way through to today. You have the PEPFAR initiative under the Bush administration, which President Obama continued, President Biden, President Trump, and Trump 1.0 and 2.0 have continued it. Even as President Trump got rid of USAID, he continued to, with a lot of phone calls going into his chief of staff and his Secretary of State, Rubio, a lot of calls saying you cannot get rid of PEPFAR, although it has been scaled back. Continuity in our security programs, the peacekeeping initiatives that we have for training African soldiers, even the Africa Command, which oversees our military engagement on the continent, has continued. At the beginning of Trump 2.0, there was talk of getting rid of AFRICOM, but so far it has continued. We've already seen, besides what they're doing in Somalia, which is, again, continuity, we saw President Trump make a strike in Nigeria. I don't know if that was a wise decision or not, but it shows a continued focus on intelligence and military activity to counter terrorist activity. Africa is it is the region with the fastest growing terrorist networks. And so that affects us both in terms of our homeland as well as our people serving abroad. And so that's an area of continuity as well. What has changed? The tone of our engagement has changed significantly. We all know the tone. I don't have to go into it in great depth. but the instruments of influence, particularly our soft power instruments of influence, of course, getting rid of USAID, the United States used to be the biggest humanitarian supporter and development supporter in terms of foreign aid. That's now gone. We got rid of our Voice of America, and so we can't compete. China has so many stations in Africa in African languages, buying up African broadcasters. So they're pushing out their messages, their ideology, whereas we shut down our Voice of America. I guess another area I would say is a significant change is the immigration policy. Close to 60% of African countries under Trump 2.0 have some type of visa ban on them so that their citizens can no longer come here, or it's much harder for them to come here. But just about 60% of those 54 countries have some form of a visa ban on them. So the immigration policy, at the same time, the Trump administration has pushed African countries fairly coercively to accept third-party, immigrants here that they're deporting. So third country deportees from the United States are showing up in countries like Swaziland, Cameroon, Rwanda, South Sudan, which is really a volatile conflict region. And so that's a big change in our policy. One of the things I'm going to come back in concluding in terms of what the United States can do to strengthen its engagement. And I think I've made the case for what our interests are, but that's something to discuss and to debate. But I think one of the challenges that has been true as well historically is that the engagement has been uneven. And particularly when you look at the presidency, unlike the Chinese, who their foreign minister visits every year, his very first trip every year is to the African continent. Xi Jinping has gone many times to Africa. For us, that hasn't been true. There was some consistency between the Bush and the Clinton administrations. Both presidents went both terms and visited the same number of countries, about 15 or so. Obama also went to Africa and visited a number of countries, particularly in his second term, less so in his first term. Trump 1.0 didn't go to Africa at all. And Biden didn't go to Africa until the last month of his presidency. And so we just haven't had the level of presidential engagement consistently across administrations that is necessary. The presidents haven't expended their political capital the way in which the Chinese have done. And this leads to a lot of uncertainty on the continent as well. President Trump, to his credit, has met with more African presidents in his first year than I think Biden did in the 4 years that he was there. Those meetings have not been normal diplomacy, I'll say. They've been a little, he sabotaged President Cyril Ramaphosa in the White House about genocide of Afrikaners, which is not true. When he met with a number of leaders from Gabon and other places that are mineral rich and petroleum rich, oil rich, gas rich, he spent a lot of time talking to them about third-party deportees from the United States. The meeting to broker agreement between Congo and Rwanda was rushed, wasn't well prepared. And as I said, it didn't, when I was looking at it, I actually said, these guys aren't even going to leave the room before this treaty, or this not a treaty, but this agreement is broken. And that proved to be the case. And so President Trump is he's in his second year. This Iran war will probably take his attention away from Africa more. But I do think that we have the initiatives. They've continued. his approach to more commercial engagement will be very much welcomed on the continent. Trade and investment, Africans have been begging for more trade and investment from American companies. They like doing business for the most part with American companies. And so I think that there's opportunity, but we've also lost some important soft power tools that would have helped us in our statecraft and diplomacy on the continent. And so with that, I'll stop and look forward to a discussion.
I, it, this is on. That was a terrific overview of both the opportunities, conditions on the continent. I would have been harsher on the Bush administration. I'm sorry, on the Trump administration than you were. But I wonder if, before opening up to questions, could I ask you to say more about things that you didn't mention? I assume you think they are important, but you gave the focus that you did, a proper focus. Governance is one.
Yeah.
Governance as a challenge, governance as a problem, governance as an opportunity, and so forth. And related to that, what I see are big obstacles: nutrition, health, and education. And of course, they're linked to governance, how the governments decide to spend their money. So I wonder if you could, use your vast knowledge of the continent to, where is it working better than others? African Union as a way of getting synergy and the benefits of cooperation, or how do you see this as related to the still colonial-like external investment in resource extraction?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Governance is absolutely critical. And I think that, we are in a more illiberal world. And so I think that that trend is also true on the continent as well. And that trend, I should say that this is an area where I think the Trump administration has also sent a signal that is probably not very helpful on the continent, because they're basically saying that we don't care too much about governance anymore, which puts them on the same footing as China, by the way. And there's many African leaders who will welcome that message, right? The ones who've been in power for 18, 20, 30, well, actually one has been in there for 30 years in Cameroon. But that message will be welcomed. The challenge here has been, how do you balance strategic interests? Where does governance fit in those strategic interests? Governance, good governance, and democracy are, I think, a prerequisite for stability. I think it's a prerequisite for stability, particularly on a continent where 60% of the population is 19 years old. Because these are the young kids who are in the streets, right? And these are also the young kids, if they don't have jobs, who are subject to being recruited by terrorists and criminal networks. One of the opportunities is that the continent, if you look at surveys of the continent, many of them being done by a group called Afrobarometer out of Ghana, the vast majority of Africans support democratic rule and democratic governance. To me, that's not that surprising. And this is where I say that the values of the United States and the values of Africa are very much aligned, because the continent, the countries on the continent, and the United States fought against foreign rule, right? And so liberty is extremely important. It's part of our defining ethos. And I don't think that anyone wants to replace dictatorship or colonial rule with dictatorship, right? And so I think that this is an area where the populations are aligned, and we need to continue to build those people to people exchanges, which is why the immigration policies are so problematic. of 60% of the countries not being able to have their citizens come to the United States, where we need to have more cultural exchanges. And so we have latent goodwill in Africa for good governance, for democratic rule, for democracy. That the African continent isn't really debating that issue too much. China is, despite all of China's propaganda and its information campaigns, it hasn't been able to shake that basic value across the continent. So good governance is fundamental, and part of good governance is not just political governance, it's also economic governance. And one of the differentiators between the United States businesses, U.S. companies, and Chinese approach was the focus on corruption and anti-corruption. And Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was seen as a pillar for that emphasis on, good economic rule of law, sanctity of contracts, a fair playing field, a lack of corrupt practices. And the Trump administration has also weakened that Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, some people would say it probably needed to be because there were some inconsistencies there. But as a signal, it's also very problematic. And so good economic governance, and that's going to be critical if, in fact, the pursuit of the interest in critical minerals and Africa's natural resources, oil and gas, are so important, and American companies are going to come in with support of the government, of our government, then that emphasis against corruption is going to be important for them to have faith in the sanctity of their contracts as well. And they're not going to, business runs away from instability, uncertainty. And certainly, I think, for instance, President Tshisekedi right now, who is the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of the richest countries on the continent in mineral wealth, in all wealth, really, solar, hydro, agricultural land as well. The United States is making a big play for DRC, but China is absolutely locked it up. And one of the things Tshisekedi is doing is taking Chinese contracts and giving them to American companies. If I was an American company, that would worry me quite a lot. Because where's the sanctity of contract there? That has to be done properly, not just by a government, taking away what you have. American companies are very concerned about that, have always been, the state being able to just take their business from them. And so I think governance is fundamental. And I think it's going to be more and more of a challenge because of interconnectivity, because of the internet. Young people are able to organize more easily. They're able to they're looking at what's happening and learning lessons from different countries, their neighboring countries. And we've seen the uprise of these young people and how fundamentally devastating it can be for the stability of a country. In places like Tunisia and in Egypt, Kenya had a run at it. I'm surprised Tanzania hasn't. So I think we're in for turbulent times across the continent because America used to have that sense of, as I was recently speaking to a former minister of Kenya who was responsible for internal security, and he was talking about America's strategic relationship with Kenya, which is strategically located, but also had similar values in terms of support for democracy and for capitalism. And he was basing his desire for that relationship to remain very strong on those two pillars. And I said, well, the democracy and governance side isn't really a focus of America right now. The strategic position, yes, and certainly economic investment for sure. So I think without America sort of being that model and that accountability basis, you're going to have some African leaders who will take advantage of that. On the nutrition, health, and education, you're absolutely right. Africa has not sufficiently invested. And so the Trump administration is not wrong in saying that African countries need to carry more of the cost, the burden sharing. They need to do more of the cost of investing in these areas, in their population, basically. Education, especially, there's been a tremendous underinvestment. On the health side, the United States has done quite a lot. And as I said, PEPFAR is still there. I think that there was a recent agreement with Kenya and a couple of other countries, some type of health pact, but the way it's being discussed in Africa is that the United States is basically trying to get Africa's medical data of its population. And so it's not being perceived by the country's citizens as necessarily anything that's beneficial to them. But the getting rid of USAID has had devastating impact on those areas of nutrition, health, and education. But education, health, and are areas where American companies, again, have leadership and can invest.
Thank you. I think it's very useful to have expanded the discussion into those dimensions of interaction. Let me follow up with another combination observation and question. And that is, you framed competition for hearts and minds and resources in Africa between the United States and China as a driving factor. I think that accurately reflects the way this administration perceives and is pursuing. But the two questions I ask about that is, how do Africans perceive it? That you know far more and have far more contact than I do. But not so long ago, when I was more actively engaged, I'll overstate it, I'll be sarcastic here. A lot of Africans saw the Chinese as another foreigner, a dumb foreigner with a fat wallet. Not interested, I absolutely agree, not interested in the ideological dimension. They don't want to be China. They don't want to be like China, except that they'd like to be wealthier and taken more seriously. But if they want to dump money into my country, I'm happy to take it. They say no strings attached. That's not quite true, but the willingness to take it on there. The way in which the U.S., particularly under this administration, has been engaged is to make you a better deal, or we will develop that aspect of infrastructure as if it's in competition. Whereas, to me, a sensible African administration would say, how can we optimize the benefits to us? If the Chinese want to build a dam and a highway, and the Americans want to build a factory that makes something, and the Europeans want to engage in a food processing plant, you need all of the dimensions of this to succeed. And it seems to me that African governments, even acknowledging limited capacity, but they should have a lot more ability to shape their interactions with the outside world than they in fact have demonstrated. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. They rhetorically say those things, right? If you look at the narrative, it's very much, we don't want you here because you're trying to compete with somebody else, right? We don't want you here only because China's here. We want you here because we want a relationship of investment, trade, investment, engagement across all aspects: military, economic, social, cultural, across all dimensions. So that's, if you go to any meeting of African conference or heads of state, they all articulate it, but then they all compete nationally. Right? That's one of the challenges with these 54 small countries. They're all competing against each other instead of like I said, the narrative is there about regional integration, but the actions don't necessarily follow from that. And so there's not one country that has the leverage on its own to be able to dictate terms. Let's put it that way, right? It's impossible for the one country that tries to have more autonomy and space for operation is South Africa, and look at how they're being hammered right now. And that didn't start with the Trump administration. That actually started with the Biden administration, in terms of hammering, because they didn't like South Africa's position on the Ukraine-Russia war. And so they really hammered South Africa, and that has now continued on. So you're not wrong. What it requires is a seriousness of the leadership on the continent to do the integration that's necessary. Now, it's not, I always say it's not just what they do, it's also what we do, right? And this is where I'll say the Bush administration worked very closely and self-consciously with the sub-regional organizations to try to create greater cooperation, whether that cooperation was around ending a war, for instance, in Liberia, working with the Ghanaians and the Nigerians and others, or that was to stop a war in Sudan, working with Uganda and Kenya, and in this case, Libya and Egypt. And so we worked with the AU, the African Union. We worked with the regional organization, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States in West Africa, to end wars. So our approach, at least on the conflict resolution side, was very much about bringing those African countries together. Whereas, I think that, so some people will say, and I say, there was a time in Africa during the Bush administration where we had leaders who had that continental vision and worked together. People like President Obasanjo of Nigeria, President Mbeki of South Africa, President Wade of Senegal, even President Kagame of Rwanda, President Moi of Kenya, and President Kibaki, who came after him. They had the resources. Basically they were like regional hegemons, and they could they could provide common goods to bring people together. And we were backing and supporting. We're supporting them as mediators. We're supporting their work to bring about that common approach to solve some of these challenges. So it's not just them, it's also how we engage them. In contrast, during the recent war in Sudan, the Biden administration blocked out the African Union, right? They put it in the hands of Saudi Arabia, and they had their Jeddah process. And they actually undermined the African Union. And the African Union to this day hasn't recovered. Now, the African Union had its own weaknesses. So I'm not claiming that their ineffectiveness today is because of the Biden administration. But the Biden administration, in many ways, significantly weakened them again. And now it's just a free-for-all, basically, in the Horn of Africa.
You've made a couple of points in that response that I'd like to underscore by inviting you to underscore them. One is, I think our biggest problem in Africa is us. It's not what the Chinese or somebody else is doing. It's not, in many respects, even what the Africans are doing. It's us. That if we got our own act together, influence wouldn't be a problem. And I think development could be accelerated. And two of the best examples of that, you were intimately involved in PEPFAR, which I regard as one of the most successful and in many ways most brilliant foreign policy initiatives that we've ever undertaken. So I invite you to explain to everyone what that is. And the other is the Millennium Challenge, which was a good idea, but hard to administer. And what have we learned from those experiences. And I think this audience would appreciate knowing more about some of the things we did sort of right.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, when the Bush administration came in 2001, one of the things that we realized in terms of our engagement with Africa was one of the biggest crises on the continent was HIV and AIDS, particularly devastating Southern Africa, but also some particular countries in West Africa and East Africa. And so what we did was, well, President Bush did a number of things. PEPFAR didn't just start. The first thing we said was we've got to increase international resources to this challenge. And so in May of 2001, President Bush pledged $200 million to a global fund that was intended to attract other countries, institutions, foundations, and others to contribute so that we can increase the level of resources going towards this problem. That global fund was an idea of Kofi Annan and President Obasanjo of Nigeria. And President Bush, again, taking political capital, personal capital, went to the Rose Garden with those two leaders and announced this first 200 million. And then he put another 200 million commitment in at the G7 meeting in May of that year, I think it was. And so that was the first part, was let's get money, get the world to put more money towards this problem and more attention to this problem. The second thing he did was, and this was a difference between the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, is how do you diagnose the problem? What really is the problem? The Clinton administration, at the end of the administration, also saw the need that this, that AIDS was an emergency in Africa. So the Clinton administration framed it as a security challenge, because when you have a security challenge, you can often get more resources out of the government to do something about something. So they framed it as a security challenge. And particularly Ambassador Holbrooke, when he was the ambassador to the UN, said, this is a problem for peacekeepers because these peacekeepers are the ones getting AIDS, right? Truck drivers and peacekeepers. And so they framed it as a security challenge. When the Bush administration came in, we said, this is not a security challenge. This is a health challenge. It's a fundamental virus that's killing people, and we need to deal with it from a health perspective. And again, our technology, our pharmaceutical companies had developed a drug called nevirapine, which if the mother takes it, it stops HIV/AIDS from being passed on to her child during childbirth. And the Health and Human Services, we brought those guys in because we saw it as a health challenge, and we got nevirapine out. And so and the easiest thing to sell to the American public is let's save the babies, right? And this was a drug, an intervention that could help save babies. And so we did that, and that was called the President's Mother to Child Transmission Initiative. And then building on that success is where PEPFAR comes in. As you build success, you also gather momentum. You get, people see that the president, this is his initiative. He cares about this. He's engaged, and everybody wants to rally around that. And so PEPFAR was basically, now we need to get the cost of drugs, of antiretroviral drugs, down. You can also not only save the babies, but save their mothers and their fathers. So that they can live longer having this intervention of antiretroviral drugs. And so PEPFAR was very much about getting antiretroviral drugs there, working with, again, our pharmaceutical companies and others. But it also had three pillars. One was prevention, and we had to build coalition. We had to talk to people. We had to build American support for this. So that included the faith-based community, which did not like condoms because they felt that led to promiscuity. So the prevention was what we called ABC, abstinence, which they very much liked, the faith-based community liked, be faithful, which they very much liked, and condoms, ABC, right? And so that was on the prevention side. Then the treatment side was getting antiretroviral drugs out. And to do that, you had to help build health clinics, local health clinics, our faith-based communities, nonprofits like World Vision and others were already working in health in rural communities in Africa. And so we were able to build off of them, but also expand that to locally based healthcare and, supporting nurses and labs and other things so that the prevention side could happen. We could get the drugs out. So, and then also was the last part of the three pillars: prevention, treatment, and care. And care was especially focused on orphans, and trying to make sure that they had the support system so that they could grow up to be active and productive adults, even though they had lost their parents. Many of these children were being raised by grandparents, and also many were orphaned. And it proved to be extremely successful, and over 25 million lives were saved because of PEPFAR. And so that one, that I think everyone agrees. And by the way, when Bush left office, he had like a 90% approval rate in Africa. And that translates not to just Bush, but to America, because people were so grateful for us coming in, working with them, and, having a focused approach to address one of their biggest challenges. The Millennium Challenge Corporation we were being pushed, the Bush administration was being pushed to put more aid. The Europeans were basically saying it should be, I don't know, 70% of your GDP or some outrageous number like that. And President Bush and his team felt that the point wasn't just to put more money there. It was actually to make sure that the output was right? That you actually got development, not just, not throwing money in a rat hole, as some people would say, but rather actually investing money, whether it's aid or investment, private investment, investing that money so that you actually had development come out of it. And the conditions for that were to choose countries that were well governed, that did not have corruption, that invested in the health and education of their population. And the compacts were designed by the country saying, not us telling them where you need to invest, but them telling us where, if an investment would occur, it would actually unlock economic value, and it would help to strengthen their economies. And so it wasn't a one approach fits all. It was really customized to the countries, and involved working closely with them and their teams to try to get, significant compacts. Some of the compacts were 200, 300, 700 million dollar compacts. And it also gave our companies the ability to have financing to go in and do some of the infrastructure development. Because there was a time in the Bush administration when China wasn't a factor for us so much. We were the biggest player in Africa, and the Europeans were the biggest player in Africa. But there was, in some of the countries, our ambassadors would say they do the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, roads and rails, and we do the soft infrastructure, health and education. We'll invest in the people, they'll invest in the infrastructure, and it'll be good for all. But at some point, we needed to also create opportunities for our companies to invest in the infrastructure as well through financing, because that's how the Chinese got a jump on us, is because their banks, and their government-owned companies had favorable financing to be able to allow them to go in, besides their opaque deals and their corruption and all the rest of the ways in which they took advantage.
One final question for me before opening it up, and that is, are there best practices models in Africa? Countries that do or could or should in some way serve as a role model for tackling the problems and getting results on their own through the AU in some other way? Where is it working?
There's no perfect model. Countries some are good or better on different dimensions. Probably one that is well overlooked and has done extremely well is Botswana. Now, Botswana had a particular, I asked one of the former presidents about this. I'm like, how did Botswana get this right? Botswana has cattle and it has diamonds, right? And the first president of Botswana was also a traditional chief. So he had formal power and he had cultural power. And where they discovered diamonds happened to be where he was a chief. And so what he said, with the authority that he had culturally, what he said, or traditionally, what he said was that anything under the earth belongs to all Botswanans. Anything on top of the earth belongs to the community where it's found. But if it's from under the earth, it's all Botswanans. And so that was one way in which wealth wasn't concentrated and was shared and used for economic development. So that's a particular thing. But what it speaks to is that Africa also has a deeper challenge of dealing with traditional authority and you know formal authority, right? And how do you manage that? And you see that in Nigeria, where you have imams or emirates in the northern part, and you can leverage that traditional authority in ways that can work very well for you if it's done properly. So that's one particular example. The other thing, though, about Botswana that was cheating, but also led to stability and governance, was that the president would always step down a year before his term ended, and he would put somebody else in power. He would transition to power, and then that person would run. And so for the longest time, the same party was in power. And it was election, but the one guy had a head start on everybody else. He had the advantage of incumbency. But just recently, the young people stopped that because they elected a party that wasn't the ruling party. They threw out the ruling party, but you still have that tradition and that respect of democratic transition and democratic governance in Botswana. So that would be one example. A second example I would give is Rwanda. Now, people would like a Rwanda on the governance side because President Kagame's been there forever. But if you look at the country in terms of its economic development, it's a place where there's a intolerance for corruption, where they're very serious about putting in place governance structures in their businesses, that they, in the business environment, where they've developed the rural area, they've increased education, they've increased health. And so the program of developing the society, and to some degree the economy, even though it's a very, very tiny economy, has gone very well. But still, the issue of governance in terms of democratic elections and is something that, there's still work to be done there. I think that so those are two examples. They're very small countries. Nigeria, I wouldn't say it's a model for anything other than the fact that they just keep surviving and they continue to believe in themselves, right? And so it's kind of very messy, but somehow they catch themselves before they fall apart. And that resilience, there's value in that resilience within the population and how they see themselves. And so I think that Nigerians basically are like, we're not going to go back to what we were. We're going to continue to progress. And also, I think that the talent in Nigeria, particularly the creative sector, is tremendous. And so I think that young population, there's young people in government, they have a self-perception of themselves that is extremely healthy, and creates resilience in society. So, I mean, those are just three. I think every country, does good on some aspects and not so well on others. But for me, I guess the measure is long-term stability, opportunity, particularly for young people, and an investment in society. I think those are absolutely critical. And to achieve that, there has to be, you've got to start rooting out corruption. You have to try to build a national identity that goes beyond regional or ethnic identity. So, if one ethnic group is getting all the goods, that's just the recipe for future conflict. And so spreading the wealth broadly like they did in Botswana, I think makes a big difference.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up now to questions. I'll start in the room, and Lou will field the questions on Zoom. You can use the chat function to post your question, and after we do a few in the room, we'll go to Zoom. So we go here. Hey, Hayden? Let me give you the mic. Otherwise, thank you.
My name is Adrian Otten, and I worked for the World Bank several years in Africa. My questions are, you have answered already quite a few of those questions, but I wanted to pinpoint on a few things. First of all, the disappearance of American assistance through the department. What has been the effect on the countries it served? It was concentrated, as far as I know, very much on medical assistance and medical organization assistance. Has that had an impact, a negative impact on those countries? Or have they been able to work more or less on the basis of what was already achieved and maintain the situation or even improve it?
Yeah. No,
That's the first question.
okay.
Okay. Go ahead, John.
Oh, okay, sure. I failed you because I wanted to look at those numbers to find out exactly. I think it varies across countries. Some have more capacity than others, like a South Africa, and others have more capacity to fill the gap.
Right.
But there's organizations like DevEx, I think it's called DevEx, that has been doing some work on this. And overall, the sense is that it's been devastating, right? It's been devastating. It's setting back issues like maternal health in other areas. So I think we haven't fully seen the impact, but like I said, PEPFAR has continued, right? PEPFAR is continuing. I don't know that it got any rise in resources, but it has continued. And the thing about PEPFAR that is important is that it wasn't just distributing drugs. So I do know that a lot of people in a lot of countries have not been able to get their antiretrovirals or to get what's the other one? HIV/AIDS, TB. They haven't been able to get their tuberculosis drugs. I know that drugs have been a problem, getting those out. But a lot of PEPFAR also helped build health infrastructure, health clinics, and labs, laboratories, and stuff. And so some of that infrastructure is still there, and it also trained medical nurses and health workers. And I think that the people and infrastructure is still there, but a lot of the drugs I think have gone away, and probably services are going down now. But I'm sorry, that's not a sufficiently detailed answer.
Yeah, no. Good enough. I have one second question. I have one second question, which is what you mentioned at the beginning, investment in infrastructure. That's something that we were very concerned about. Number one, because there were not many, let us say, there was not much infrastructure in terms of roads, railways, or dams, if you want, in Africa at all. But the almost as important problem was that the countries had a very hard time in maintaining the quality of infrastructure that they already had, and which made us worried about investing in new infrastructure, because if we were not able to strengthen maintenance and renewal of already existing infrastructure.
Mhm.
That is my last question.
Yeah, yes, I hear you. What can I say? I don't know. I think you have to have business models, which help to accommodate that. I worked for I consulted for a health company at one point, and they were putting, diagnostic machines. That's what they were selling, basically. They called it an investment, but they were basically selling diagnostic machines. But the contract has to have some type of component of maintenance as part of that contract, so that diagnostic machine is sustainable and continues to operate. And so I think it's partly about what the business model is for maintenance, right? One other thing I'll say, because you work at the World Bank and I'm at Hoover, we're doing work with the World Bank right now on looking at issues of the cost of capital, and where World Bank money can come in, the subsidy can come in, but where business can actually make a financial rate of return. So we're looking at historical rates of return, and where business can make a financial rate of return, they shouldn't use subsidy, right? Subsidy should go to projects or infrastructure where there's a social return, but the financial return to the business is not going to be there. And that's where blended finance should come in. And so if it's a private company that's investing in infrastructure and they can make a profit, right? They can make a high enough rate of return. Then again, I'll say there should be some type of the model itself should lend itself to maintenance. But I do hear you. I don't know about how you do that. I mean, there's a great new road built by the Chinese in Nairobi that gets you. When I used to try to drive to the airport I have an apartment in Nairobi. It used to take me 2.5 hours. With that new road, which is a toll road, I can get there in 30 minutes. And because it's a toll road, it's making economic return that can then be used for maintenance, I think. I hope that answers. I mean, I would be interested in what how you see it.
Thanks for super communication. Are there any questions here in the room? Not immediately. Lou, do you have any on Zoom?
Yes, we do. And it's about tuberculosis, the disease. The question is, could you give some more information about regional public health progress with respect to tuberculosis?
Well, no, I'm sorry, I don't have that knowledge. But what I can say is that when I was reading about the impact of getting rid of USAID, the stories that were being told were especially about people who had tuberculosis and not being able to get their drugs.
All right. As a follow-up question, then, the fact that USAID went from whatever it was to zero in a matter of 2 to 4 weeks, it's been over a year now. Have there been any other countries or any other NGOs that have started to take the place of USAID?
Yeah, so USAID was gotten rid of, but some of the functions, particularly on the humanitarian side, were shifted into the State Department. So there's still some resources going towards that through State Department offices. Um, a lot of discussion has been going on among foundations, the Gates Foundation, MasterCard Foundation, Ford Foundation, and others about trying to fill the gap with an understanding that they cannot fill the gap. And so now the emphasis is on how can you provide this type of assistance smarter, and so people are having conferences and meeting and trying to say, for instance, leverage AI and other, like for diagnostics and stuff, trying to leverage technology and new approaches to try to not fill the gap, but at least continue to catalyze or to support areas that USAID now has, because it's gone, has been abandoned.
And what's the consensus to date about being able to use technology to help fill in those areas?
I think there's great optimism about being able to use technology in that way, particularly, frankly, AI. There are ways in which you can do diagnostics, basic diagnostics, blood pressure, this and the other, and also have remote doctors or remote nurses. I think, and there are American companies that are rolling out some of those systems in Africa today. So I think that there's great optimism around that. I do know that I'm involved in a project now that is forecasting using AI and trying to find areas of resilience and fragility in being able to use AI to try to predict where you're going to have those challenges as well, so that you can then mobilize resources quickly to that area. You're pre-positioned effectively, rather than simply responding to an emergency. And that's, again, an AI tool that's a forecasting.
Lou, do you have any more online questions?
I have a personal question, but if you have questions in the room, just go ahead.
No, go ahead, Lou, with your question.
So, from my point of view, you painted a picture of many, many challenges for America, particularly vis-a-vis where China is. Over the next 5 to 10 years, what does our country need to do to try to work to turn this situation around?
Great question. First of all, we need to get our diplomatic engagement ready, because right now in 54 countries, there are 34 embassies without ambassadors. That's not true of the Chinese. They have ambassadors across the continent. So I don't know what the problem is with getting ambassadors out in the field. I do know that the Trump administration just a month ago recalled a whole bunch of ambassadors. These are career foreign officers, because they suspected that they weren't America First ideology, right? But these are career foreign service officers who worked with Democratic and Republican administrations. And without having senior people in the field engaging these countries, we're at a huge disadvantage. That many posts being empty is almost unimaginable. So they've got to get our diplom. They've got to have some. I think the administration has made a huge mistake in its suspicion about our diplomatic corps and our foreign service officers. They have tremendous experience. They're used to working for different administrations, Republican and Democratic. And by the way, it's going to take a long time to actually replenish that expertise and that experience. And so that is probably the thing that I would say most. Secondly, I think that they have to do a better job. I mean, honestly, they're not the initiative. I mean, it's not the initiatives. I would say that the policies. For instance, like I said, the Congo-Rwanda peace agreement, that wasn't driven by anything other than, frankly, ego, right? It was driven by ego, and not just of one person. The person who wanted to get it on the before the president wanted the president to recognize him as having gotten it there, right? It wasn't ready. It was not properly cooked. And he rushed it, and then the president rushed to be in front of the camera for his Peace Prize, and none of that, and then it failed. And so diplomatic engagement and serious policy design and engineering and is required, and it's not happening in a consistent way yet under this administration in Africa. So I think there's a rush to the camera, and not the work being done behind it to actually build something that is sustainable. And you're having even harder time doing that, like I said, because you don't have the career diplomats in the field. That's like taking out your best quarterback and running back and everything, and then say, okay, I'm going to win the Super Bowl. You're not going to. And so I think that's one of the big challenges, is that, and I also think there's a mindset challenge that's necessary. And the mindset challenge is to see Africa as core to our achieving our global objectives. Traditionally, administrations have treated Africa as, they've ranked, you can look in the national security strategy and see how the regions are ranked, and that tells you where the priorities are. And then also some have said, oh, Africa is just a humanitarian interest. President Trump now is saying Africa is more of a commercial interest. And, we have to stop doing that and say, how does Africa fit into what we're trying to achieve globally? Right. And so I think there has to be that mindset, both in terms of our understanding of Africa's place and our global strategy. And secondly, in terms of our orientation to have a direct relationship with African countries. PEPFAR was a direct relationship. It was like, we didn't do PEPFAR because we were trying to, outpace China. We did PEPFAR because this was a need in Africa. This was a demand, and this was something that was in the way of us achieving our objectives on the continent. And so having that direct relationship, I think, is also, and that's also partly mindset, is also critical. I don't think resources are the problem. Obviously we lost a lot with USAID, but I do think that the American enterprise system, our companies and our businesses, with support of the government, with financing, guarantees, and other types of instruments, will be able to actively, I think Africans would welcome that investment. And I know American companies would welcome a consumer market that's just growing and growing and growing. The continent is urbanizing so fast. And so there's tremendous opportunity for us to do business on the continent.
Thank you.
Jandai, thank you for for giving us the time, for doing a terrific presentation. Responses to questions were very illuminating. I'm convinced there are opportunities that we have not taken advantage of in Africa. The problem is at least 50% us rather than an Africa problem. I hope we get our act together. I thank you very much for making the time and the presentation. Remind everybody that the video will be posted in a few days. If you want to go back over other things, the video from last week is up. And as we close the evening, a reminder that next week's subject is, again, fracturing alliances, implications for pursuit of nuclear weapons. And our speaker will be Dan Snyder, who's a specialist on Japan and Korean security. So, Lou, do you have any for the Zoom?
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you again for a great presentation. And I'll just say that I will shortly stop the recording and then stop the meeting, and look forward to all of you next week, either in person or on Zoom. Make sure you don't lose the Zoom information, because you'll need that again next week. So that's all I have to say. Tom, do you have any final words?
No, you can, yes, applause and they go through.
Thank you. Thank you very
Right.
much. It's been a great pleasure.
And we can end the recording now and Jim and I let me back on campus.
All right, thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye.